Welcome to the community development track. You are in the small town broadband session. My name is Liz Martin. I'm the photo editor at the Gazette. I am merely the room host, so I'm just here as tech support. I hope you all enjoyed Carson King's keynote. This is going to be the first of 2 sessions this morning. If you miss anything, these are being recorded. If you have another session that you wanted to watch that's happening right now, you'll be able to find those on the Iowa Ideas website after this conference is over. So if you've got questions during this session, you can use Whova to submit those, and I will be sending those over to Gage. We do have the Zoom chat function turned off so that I'm getting those over to Gage as quickly as possible. So I am at this point just going to introduce you to Gage Muskimin. He is our Lynn County and Marion reporter, and he is going to be leading the session. So I'll let Gage take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. As you guys may know, rolling in here, this is the small town broadband session. So we'll spend 60 minutes talking about the issues surrounding that. Our panelists today are Matt Behrens. He's the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the state of Iowa. And Pattymanuel is Director of PR at Maquoketa Valley Electric Cooperative. I'm going to let them kind of go into their roles and give you a little rundown on the introductions of these issues. Matt, would you like to go first and kind of give us an overall analysis here?
Sure. Thanks, Gage. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this really important topic. I know especially as we're going through these difficult times with the pandemic and people may be changing up some of the ways that they work and that they go to school or communicate with their doctors, it's really highlighted for all of us how important broadband has become to daily life. As you said, my role here is as the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the state of Iowa. And in that capacity, I'm really responsible for the kind of the oversight of the state's central IT organization. But in addition to that, I help to manage and administer Governor Reynolds' Empower Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program. So I thought what I would do this morning is just introduce a little bit about the program and talk about broadband kind of overall in Iowa, and then provide some resources information that people who are interested in broadband development in their communities might find useful. So when we think about broadband across the state, a lot of times you'll hear about the concept of mapping. And I'm going to be referring to some PowerPoint slides that I think those of you who are attendees may have access to. And I'll kind of be going through some things on those slides, but I'll try to, for those who don't have them, I'll try to do some translation so that what I'm talking about makes a little more sense. But one of the things that our office does is provide a map of broadband availability across the state of Iowa. And one of the key data sources for that map over the years has been data made available by the Federal Communications Commission. And they take reports from broadband providers all across the United States. And they report, I think, twice a year. They aggregate all that data and then they publish it. And then we take that information and then republish it and make some adjustments to it to create a broadband map of the state of Iowa. And then that map becomes kind of the basis for incentive programs that the state offers under the Empower Rural Iowa program to help increase the availability of broadband across the state. So as we look at where Iowa's at right now, according to the FCC, one of the things that FCC will tell us is that about 84.2% of rural Iowans have access and about 98.3% of urban Iowans have access. But one of the things that we know after a lot of analysis, and you'll see commented on frequently in the press and elsewhere, is that that data from the FCC is really flawed. Because of the methodologies that are used to create the data, the reporting that's a part of it, it's generally over-reporting availability in the state. So we have cause to believe that, in fact, fewer than 84.2% of rural Iowans have access to broadband at speed levels of 25 megabits down, 3 megabits per second up or faster. And so what we've been working on in my office is developing and implementing new maps. And these maps are really designed to take a more granular look at how data can be improved over time. And so we're in the process right now, actually, of releasing a new map, and it'll become available on our website later this month. And that map is designed to build not only on the FCC data, but also on direct information from communication service providers across the state. So all communication service providers were contacted, their information was gathered, and then we published that map on our website and made it available for the public to comment on. And so we're in the process right now of synthesizing all that public feedback about where we thought the map was right or where it was wrong. You say, I have internet access here, but I really don't, so that we can make the best map available possible for programs that we administer. And then we're periodically required to keep that map updated. So we're excited that we're going to hopefully have a better map that'll be more reflective of the realities of broadband service on the ground, especially in rural areas. And then that map will become the basis for the upcoming Power Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program. So what we'll be doing here in November or later this month in October preliminarily is beginning to make grant funds available. This round of grants will be for $5 million. And those grants will make state funds available to targeted service areas. And those are the areas on the map that we've identified have no service at all. And so the incentives under this program will be about 35%, up to 35% of state matching funds for communication service providers who want to install broadband service in an area that's currently unserved. And that what's interesting to us is that the way that this program is designed, it's really pretty open to any type of communication service provider. So it can be your traditional sort of telephone company. It can be a for-profit or nonprofit. One of the prior rounds of grant programs that we had was awarded to a city, a municipality that was going to build their own municipal broadband network. And so if you're representing an organization or you're involved in an organization that's thinking about getting into broadband, I'd really encourage you to take a look at the program that's going to be coming up later this month, because there may be an opportunity for you to submit as an applicant to that program. So there's a slide on my deck called Broadband Grant Program History, and it shows a map of the state of Iowa and talks a little bit about all of the programs that we've awarded to date. We've been doing this for a few years now, and we've had multiple rounds of grants and property tax exemption programs for broadband infrastructure installation that we've administered. We estimate that about $40 million in grants have been awarded to 80 applications, and our estimates are that that's about 57,000 homes, schools, and businesses that will be served upon completion of those projects. Now, they're not all completed yet because it takes a significant amount of time to install broadband in an area, to put fiber optic cables in the ground or whatever the technology type is that the provider is going to use. But that's 57,000 people that are homes, more people than that, homes that were not served before, but will ultimately be served as a part of these programs. So it's a really exciting effort that we want to make sure people are aware of so that they can continue to take advantage of it as we proceed into the future. This year, earlier this summer, we had a round of grants for under the CARES Act, the federal money associated with the CARES Act. And one of the programs that we had underneath that effort was kind of a digital equity program, and it's the first time we've done one of those. And its focus was on getting folks who don't subscribe to an internet connection today to make that decision to subscribe to an internet connection. We call that adoption. So we're interested in increasing adoption for broadband programs. And under that initiative, we received 15 applications and awarded over $2 million in funds. And those funds will provide $500 subscription discounts to people who are in areas already served but had not yet made the decision to subscribe to a broadband service at their location. And that'll serve about 4,500 people under those applications who didn't have service. They could have subscribed to it but chose not to. And so they'll be able to receive a discount under that program to their subscription. So as I mentioned, just as we talk about resources that are available to you, my office is kind of here as a clearinghouse for broadband questions in the state. And I would encourage you, if you have a question about broadband, to certainly reach out to us. The best way to do that is to go to our website, ocio.iowa.gov. You can also email our team by sending an email to OCIO grants all one word, OCIO grants at iowa.gov. When you go out to our website, you'll learn a little bit more about the previous programs and the one that's coming up soon, that $5 million opportunity that we'll be publishing later this month. And you'll also be able to see the state of Iowa broadband availability maps. And later this month, we'll be publishing the final map that, as I mentioned, aggregates all that information from the providers that we gathered and the comments from the public. So we're here as a resource to the people of Iowa, to communication service providers, to communities that are interested in getting involved in broadband planning. And if there's anything we can do to be of service to you folks, please do let us know, and we'll be happy to work with you and coordinate and answer any questions you might have, because it's such an exciting and important program. So Gage, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. And now we'll let Pattymanuel, as I mentioned, who's the director of PR at Maquoketa Valley Electric Cooperative, get into what she does and what her company does in the process of actually setting up broadband across the state.
Well, thanks, Gage, and that was interesting for me too, Matt, so appreciate that. So yeah, why is an electric cooperative sitting at this table today? Our cooperative is located in East Central Iowa. We primarily serve rural areas, but we do touch the edges of many communities, covering Jones, Jackson, Delaware, and Dubuque counties, and portions of the counties that touch those. As you can see on the slides, if you have them in front of you, but if not, we have almost 14,000 electric members. And by the end of the month, we'll have over 4,000 fiber members or communications members. Our electric cooperative is a little bit different than other ones in the state in two reasons. First, we have about 5 members per mile of line compared to some electric cooperatives in the western or the southwestern part of the state that might only have 2 or 3 members per mile of line. And for those people that are not in the utility industry, that can compare to, Alliant Energy and Mid-American, who could have 100 or more in a mile. The other thing that makes us a little bit different is for the last 20 years, we have done a lot of work to make ourselves nationally recognized as a smart grid leader. We were one of the first utilities in the state to deploy automated metering across our entire system. All of our line crews have GIS. We have a lot of technology and all of our substations and our line equipment. And we just reached a point where we needed connectivity to be a little bit better so that we could connect between our membership and here at our headquarters. So then when we started doing surveys of our membership and just visiting with them, we started to learn that over the last almost 15 years, they have been asking us for a broadband service. They all felt that what they had wasn't strong enough or sufficient enough for their needs. And so it just kind of came together that we needed the service, our membership needed the service. And as a co-op, that's how we operate, is how do we meet the needs of our membership. And we also recognize that we were a little unique in other providers in the sense that we already had a lot of the infrastructure in place. We already had poles and wires that we could reach a lot of the rural areas where other providers are going to have to build that. So in 2016, our board of directors made the decision that we would extend fiber. Our intent was to touch all of our electric members, or at least those that were interested. And then we could expand beyond our membership as our service area touched that. The state of Iowa's electric service territory laws is very difficult for the average person to look at. You can go into a housing subdivision and drive down the street, and one side of the street will be served by one utility and the other side of the street by us. And so if we're building a fiber network down that street, we may as well serve the people on both sides of the street if they're interested. When we started this, we started a sign-up process that generated a lot of interest. Today, we have over 7,000 people signed up. At least 5,000 or so have already committed to service. In that 4 years, we were able to build 2,000 miles of fiber line. Actually, we're closer to 2,200, I believe, right now. And as we got into the pandemic, we definitely saw an even greater need for public Wi-Fi, need for greater speeds, how could we build it yesterday? And we were already facing that by our people that wanted it yesterday, but it really came to light with this pandemic. As far as the topic of this conversation today about broadband in a small community, we see opportunities for public-private partnerships. We have seen rural communities be very proactive. They have come to us. And when I say a community, I don't always mean just a small town. I also mean small neighborhoods. And so they have reached out to us and said, what can we do? We want to help bring you in. And I know from a city perspective, that can be quite a difficult task when you have multiple providers that may want to be in there. But at the end of the day, it's up to you and your residents to know, what do you need for speed and what do you need for service, and who can best meet that, and when, and how much time will it take to come into your community? So things that a community can do to demonstrate what the industry knows as take rates. You can have people that are interested or say they're interested, but will they really take the service? And so helping us determine that is great. The other thing we've learned is one size does not fit all. There's going to be a certain percent of population that's going to be happy with cable, and there's some that are fine with wireless, even satellite. From our perspective and what we've learned in the industry is fiber is the gold standard. And so our MV-Link fiber can bring up to a gigabit of service to our members. We are offering symmetrical speeds with our minimum residential package at 85 megabits per second with 85 up, 85 down. And that has been very well received. But the other thing we are learning too is education is so important, not only to what the value of fiber is, because so many people have no idea, but also the education on, we have people say, well, gee, you hooked me up. Now will you teach me how to set up a Gmail account? Or what do you mean you don't offer TV? What's streaming TV? So we have a lot of things that some of us take for granted, but others have no idea. And then we've also learned that network construction takes time. As I mentioned yesterday, everybody wants it yesterday, and we can't build it, that fast. And as I said, it's taken us 4 years to get those 2,000 miles built. So with that, we do have our website, our co-op website of MVEC, short for Maquoketa Valley Electric Cooperative, .coop or .com. And on there, you can find all things MV-Link if you have more questions. Thanks, Gage.
Yeah, thank you, Patty, for that. And just for those listening, just in case, maybe this is a follow-up question for you, Patty. Maybe some folks don't know what broadband specifically means, or other key terms like fiber. Can we get like a quick explainer there just before we move on with more details of the conversation?
Well, I think the word broadband just encompasses a way to receive the internet service. So, some people just think of, I have the internet, but broadband can cover anything from twisted pair cable to wireless to DSL that some of you may be familiar with. So it's just an all-encompassing term.
Sure. And then going into, we're probably gonna be using the word fiber a lot. What does that necessarily mean for broadband, of course?
Fiber is basically glass. The first time I looked at fiber cable and they cut it apart, if you can just imagine a hair on your head, it's several hairs within one cable, and each hair can carry data. So that's pretty basic terminology, but that data is actually a piece of glass. And so light goes through that glass, and the speed of light helps direct what the speed of fiber is essentially. And that's where we constantly talk about high speed and how fast it is. And when you have people that are sitting at speeds of 25.3, they really don't have a concept of what 100 megabits per second or a gig is.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to make sure. You never know if people know. I don't know if my grandparents are in the chat, they might not know. But of course, speaking of the chat, as we go along, if you guys have any questions, we want this to be an interactive for the panelists. But of course, as Iowa Ideas is about sharing these ideas and talking about bettering the state with those ideas. What is the overall goal here? What are we trying to accomplish in the state with broadband moving forward? And is there a timeline of what Iowans can kind of expect? This might be more geared towards you, Matt, but Patty, if you have anything to add, go ahead.
Sure. So I think ultimately the goal is for all Iowans to have connectivity to robust and reliable high-speed access to the internet. The timeframes for reaching some of those ultimate outcomes that are desired, are various, because different broadband solutions, different technologies will have different sort of installation requirements. Different groups have different timelines and horizons for investment. And really, it's not a uniform product that exists in the same conditions in every location. It's highly variable. And so there probably isn't a date on the calendar as it stands today for when everyone will have access in every location all the time. And that's partly because it's such a large problem, and it's so different depending on where your location is and what your circumstances are. There're just going to be different requirements for installation, different economic considerations, different factors that have to be judged and taken into consideration. So we don't have a timeline at the current time for when that can be completed, but we know that it's an effort that's, because it's so big and because it requires so many different solutions in different specific situations, that it's an effort that's going to take everyone's involvement. So it's not just one communication service provider in your community, or a state grant, or a city working on this. It's everyone working together to try to solve the problem with the specific sets of considerations that are in place for that location. And that's why it's hard to put a date on it, or a time, or an overall cost, because installing broadband is such a different situation depending on each location that we're talking about.
Sure. And Patty, for you specifically, I mean, what's that process of installing broadband like for your company? What's kind of the timeline there?
Well, as I mentioned many times, we wished we would have started this 10 years ago when our members first started asking us, or longer ago than that, because we are finding the amount of time it takes to do it, even with our infrastructure already in place. And I have learned, Matt has mentioned the Empower Rural Iowa initiative that our governor has started. And I am a task force member on the Connect side of things. And so I've really gotten to learn that this isn't just about providing my own house with a faster, better, more reliable service, but all of the things that I have learned. We are amazed at the number of farmers who really need a better internet service, how technology driven our farm community really is. We've had farmers tell us, if you can bring me Wi-Fi to my tractor in the middle of this cornfield, wow, look what I could do. There's companies that are flying drones over crop fields and bringing data back and need good Wi-Fi. So there are so many needs, telehealth, especially during this pandemic. And I think it's opened up how many companies realize that there is a need, and how can we step in and help? And so I know nationwide, other electric cooperatives that aren't already in this business with us are looking at it, as are multiple wireless and just a lot more fiber companies as well.
Cool. And then looking at it, what areas of the state are most affected by this lack of broadband? Are there certain sectors that or certain areas, regions that, I guess, have less of a access to service? And then how do you expand to those service to those areas moving forward? And then who kind of decides where and when that broadband expands?
Sure. So I can take a crack at that. It's if you anyone who's on this call that has a chance to look at the slides or the map can kind of get a general sense of where broadband is and where it isn't. And we see kind of pockets all around the state where there's a deficit in broadband availability, but it's a problem, I think, from that standpoint, that where it's really focused on areas where there's a lower population density primarily. And so when communication service providers are making decisions about where to make investments and where to install new broadband capacity, one of the things they're looking at is the rate of return on the investment that they're going to make in that capital infrastructure. And where the homes are farther apart, for instance, and there are fewer subscribers because of that, it makes the economic, the return on investment a little more challenging. And really, that's where the Empower Rural Iowa program comes into place. It's focused on trying to make those economic models more attractive to providers to install in those lower population density areas by reducing the overall cost. So when we offer a grant for, say, 35%, as we will in this case, the hope is that that offer of funds will help to kind of pivot the economic model to help that provider find the return on investment for that project. And so the thing that we do from our vantage point with the program is we kind of identify the areas where service isn't. And then the applicants, the providers who want to install broadband, they make the decisions about, out of all those areas we've identified, which are the ones that they want to go serve in. And so it's complicated, but part of it is based on, when you look at the map, you're going to find places that don't have service to be disproportionately more rural than places that do have service. And that tends to be one of the key distinctions about served areas versus unserved areas.
Sure. And then how does Iowa fare compared to other states in internet/broadband access for its residents? Is in the same boat as other Midwestern states? Kind of where are we at?
We think right now we're kind of in the middle of the pack. So there's some states that have better broadband connectivity rates than we do, and there's some states that have worse. And so it's really where you see is kind of the striation is between sort of rural and more urban states. So if you look at a state like Rhode Island, for instance, which is very small, there, and there's not a lot of rural areas in Rhode Island, of course, then their connectivity rate is going to be much, much higher. Whereas if you look at a state like Alaska, they're going to have a bigger problem because of the geographic issues that accompany a state of that size. And we're somewhere in the middle, where we're kind of in the middle of the rural states. We're in the Midwest. We have a large rural population, and so we're going to be kind of in that middle of the pack.
Cool. We actually have a question in the chat, and as people ask, I'll tie these into my own questions and not just save them all for the end. So the first question is, do you see meeting that goal of equitable access across the state as a way to provide equitable economic gains?
Well, we know from the research that there is a correlation between broadband access and gains to, for instance, GDP. And so I do think that increasingly, as we look at a digital economy, we look at some of the barriers of distance that can be reduced through broadband connectivity, that ubiquitous broadband access will have significant returns to the state's economy over time. It is one way, for instance, that we can help to keep people who want to live in rural communities there, help them start businesses because of that connectivity. So I think that there are all kinds of gains that can accrue from an economic standpoint as a result of more people having access, for sure.
Sure. And we have another question in the chat. Patty, this might be more geared towards you. Often we hear complaints about perceived poor service due to a lack of competition between service providers or only one provider available. Any thoughts on that issue there?
Yes, I think that's definitely perceived, and I think it was actually definitely very real with the derecho. I was talking with a bank the other day. They have 21 branches, and with the derecho, 19 of the 21 were out of service. And a lot of those were along Highway 20 into Dubuque and that area, which wasn't even as impacted as what the Cedar Rapids, Iowa City area was. And I think it's making people realize that even if they thought their service was okay prior, what about having a backup service, especially if you're a business? And what about having a backup vendor that could maybe guarantee or be better prepared to meet needs? And so I definitely think having more than one provider is a good thing. And I think in Iowa, we really have that. I think, Matt can probably speak to this, but I think the last I recall, Iowa has more rural telephone cooperatives or companies than most states in the nation. And a lot of those have been very proactive and very aggressive at also running fiber internet services. And so I think for some of us in Eastern Iowa, especially, my own house, I live 3 miles from the nearest town, which is a town of 700 people, and I have 2 options for a direct fiber connection.
Matt, did you have anything to add to that as well?
Well, I would agree with everything Patty said. I mean, I think anytime we can see competition working, that's favorable for the consumer. And so, you know, the circumstances of competition across the state of Iowa in terms of how many homes have multiple choices. I don't have the data on that right in front of me, but I think it's variable. There are lots of places where there's one choice and there's lots of places where there's more than one choice. And, you know, I think in terms of service quality, in terms of price, having multiple providers at your doorstep is always a good thing. And so hopefully, you know, we'll see more locations over time that will have access to multiple providers so that, for example, as Patty pointed out, if there's a storm and there's an impact, there might be the ability to have some redundancy there over time. And that's a great thing for businesses. It's a great thing for everyday people.
Yeah, and Patty started kind of getting into this a little bit, but I'd like to explore this issue a little bit further. Of course, 2020 hasn't been the most convenient year for everybody, and especially in Eastern Iowa. Not only in the midst of this current pandemic that we're in, a derecho came through. How has the process of expanding broadband in Iowa been affected by one or both of these events? They might be completely separate talking points for you guys. In a general sense, and for companies that help provide that service. So I'd love to hear both of your kind of experiences this year specifically with providing service.
From my vantage point, I'll say 2 things. The first is that, as I mentioned in my sort of introductory remarks, this experience of the pandemic has really raised awareness, I think, among everyone about the importance of broadband. It's no longer sort of a luxury or a nice to have. It's something that's critical for our participation in everyday life, especially when we find ourselves at home more often. For people who are unable to access broadband, they're at a disadvantage when it comes to opportunities for telework or distance learning or telehealth. And that's a disadvantage that we have an obligation and a duty to try to resolve over time. So that first point, I guess I would make is that it seems like if there was disagreement 5 years ago about whether broadband is a necessity, I think a lot of that has changed over those last 5 years, and specifically at this point in time when we all realize how important that connectivity is. The second thing I would say, at least from my standpoint as someone who's administering broadband grant programs for the state, is that we have seen the availability of additional funds. And so the big item for us this year was the CARES Act making available, up to $50 million for broadband programs across the state of Iowa, which is a huge down payment on helping us over time address these, these critical areas where the need is so present, but has yet been not fulfilled. And so, as I sit here today, this has been a very difficult time for everybody. But if there's a silver lining, I think those may be a couple of things that would come to my mind. And Patty, I don't know what things you would add.
Well, yes, both instances this year have impacted us. With the pandemic, initially what our cooperative did is we increased the packages, the speeds that we offered to our members at no additional cost for about a 2-month period, knowing how many people were working and learning from home and really struggling. So that was very well received. And then we opened up our headquarters here has large parking areas. And so we opened up public Wi-Fi there and notified the schools that those students that didn't have service could use that. And that was also well received. And we continue to do that. And actually nationally right now, there's going to be an announcement next week of all of the different public Wi-Fi spots that will be available to people just because of that great need. The other thing on maybe the negative side that impacted us is we really had to halt temporarily going into our members' homes and bringing them service. And so those face-to-face in-home installations slowed up, and it was right during the height of our construction season. As we all know, Iowa is limited as to when we can be building. And while we kept building the line out in the country, getting into homes, talking about where the drop would go, or helping them get their final connection, we had to halt. And we were glad when we could finally figure out a way to do it safely, and when our membership was comfortable with us coming back in with our masks. And so we have ramped up and are back to our normal schedule now. But yes, definitely a challenging year.
Definitely. I have a reminder for everybody in the chat when use the chat window, not the session Q&A section. The Q&A limits the length. So use the chat window. It's a lot easier. Speaking of which, we have another question. It's a little bit long. I'll read it. One of the problems with TIFs is the difficulty of determining whether a given project would have been completed without taxpayers' money. The AT&T monopoly was one way of dealing with this. Community ownership is another. But Iowa's broadband is a public-private partnership, so the same issues exist as with TIFs. Is there any plan after taxpayer financing of a fiber extension for a payback to the state, or is this another case of socialism for the capitalist, free private enterprise for the taxpayers?
Well, that's a bigger question than I'm capable of answering. I mean, what our programs are really designed to do is provide a grant, and I can't speak on behalf of TIF or other financing structures that may exist for a community to look at. What we're really focused on in the Empower Rural Iowa Broadband Grant Program is providing matching funds to help solve that immediate near-term installation cost for the carrier, and to help, kind of, as I said, lower that that economic hurdle that they have to get over in order to make some of these areas financially attractive to move into. And I wish I could answer in more detail about the scenarios of TIF or the other considerations that factor into financing broadband, either for municipalities or for private sector carriers, but some of that's beyond the scope of my responsibilities here, for sure.
Sure. And back with, this year specifically with the pandemic, we've experienced students all across the state have to turn to online learning. And there are many students across state who may not have reliable internet access. For both of you in your roles, have you had to respond to these issues in a different way now that some students need this, that it's essential for them to work online in some cases?
It hasn't done anything in specific on hotspots for students or anything like that, but it has very much been discussed often. When you have families tell us, hey, I have to have more speed tomorrow because my kids can't do their homework at the same time I'm doing my office work. So thankfully, if they're already connected with us, we can flip a switch and they have more speed. But we are finding there are just still numerous issues among our local schools on how do we keep these kids connected. And I know our libraries are trying innovative things to try to help. And, I think there's just a multitude of organizations that could really help with all of this, from the education I mentioned earlier, but schools, libraries, even churches, anybody that's got an organization or a network of people that can help someone else be connected. I think that's what makes Iowa nice.
Sure. What about you, Matt?
I would just talk about a couple of the things that are going on from an education standpoint. Earlier this year, the Iowa Department of Education announced some grants for school districts that were associated with sort of the, the provision of Wi-Fi hotspots and similar connectivity needs for students. And so I think it was in the $20 million range or thereabouts that were made available to try to help kind of catalyze some of those investments at the school district level to help those students who may not be able to afford or have access to connectivity at home so that they could access distance learning remotely. And so that's been one of the big things that we are excited on and focused on for through the use of the CARES funding that was made available to the state, or excuse me, GEAR funding that was made available to the state. I think another thing that Patty points out is that there is a problem kind of underneath a lot of this increased access to connectivity that we have to address, and that is how we begin to build structures of support for people who may not be as familiar with technology so that they can make more effective use of it. And so there is perhaps work to be done on improving digital skills and making sure that people are comfortable with the computer that's in their home. And so I do think that really becomes an exercise for schools to work on and for communities. One thing we talked about the other day is that there is some research out of Purdue University, I think, concerning how the way that churches can contribute to this as being sort of community centers to help begin to provide training for people who may not be familiar with the computer on how to use it. If you've never encountered a computer before and you get a high-speed internet connection, a new computer in your home, it can be sort of a daunting experience to learn, how do I get a Facebook account? How do I connect, talk to the grandchildren? Those sorts of things. And so we really need to be thinking as a community, as Iowans together, about how we help to reduce some of those gaps that may exist in terms of people's ability to really effectively make use of this technology.
Yeah, and going off of that, how does that process work? Both of you have mentioned how education of what broadband is and how that will help communities is super important in the process. How do you go about educating those different communities? Is it really like coming at the community as a whole and trying to get kind of an lapping, sweeping kind of education process, or is it really kind of like a individual based thing? And what are the obstacles there as you go about that for both of you?
So one of the things that I think is important when we talk about any of this is that communities are really a center of enormous strength and commitment and power really in the broadband space. And so bringing together interest groups, anchor institutions, bringing that community together to coalesce around a broadband project is a hugely important effort. And while we don't have a formal practice established at this time to really help communities with a toolkit, for instance, we are here as a resource. And so if you're in a community that's thinking about doing this, I would encourage you to reach out to us, if for nothing else than to kind of get a primer on how broadband grant programs work, so that if your community is interested in building out some of these capabilities for yourselves, and how we can help and provide assistance. But there really is this enormous community planning effort that goes into broadband infrastructure expansion, or that can go into it. And so really, if you're a community or a small town that's thinking about taking a step into building out a broadband network or attracting a communication service provider to your community, there is an effort to be discussed there about how you go about building that sort of coalition. One of the things in a city that I worked with in the past that received a grant program, for instance, was they surveyed all of their community members. And so they had survey data to show what the interest levels were, that if there was a connection available at the home, whether that the person that was at that home would subscribe to it. And that's really important evidence to begin to market to communication service providers who might be in your area, to say, hey, there's a market here for you. And so there's some techniques and strategies like that that I think can be deployed that are hugely valuable, that communities that are thinking about getting into the broadband space might consider working on. Networking with some communities that have already taken this first step would be really important to get a sense of what that roadmap is, and to learn a little bit about from their successes and from their failures, so that you can make a plan for your own community going forward. Those are some things that I would recommend.
Sure. What about you, Patty? What's been your experience there?
Well, one of the things that we had talked about and we're starting to put in place was to find some public facilities that we actually provided service to, where we could have little, morning coffees or evening cookies or something, and just have some little workshops and teach people some of these basics and try to get more people involved. But about the time we started having really heavy conversations on that, COVID hit, and we're like, yeah, that's not going to go over very well. And so we also recognize that there has to be some education. And I think, all of you young people that are listening that are really techie, I mean, even my grandkids could probably teach my mother how to use the internet a lot better than I could teach her. And so don't be afraid to step in and try to help those people. And as far as communities, totally agree with Matt. How does a community really gauge what's their interest? You personally may be struggling with your own internet service, and you may think everybody in town has the same issues, but maybe they don't. Maybe they're perfectly happy with their 25.3 speed and that it goes out on them now and then. If that's what they're happy with, don't just assume they need it. The other thing we've seen proactive communities do is what I would almost call project management. How do they collect service agreements for us? That they're the ones that have the contacts, especially if they have a municipal in place. And along the same lines, if they have a municipal, there could maybe be some infrastructure sharing. We share conduit, or we share poles, or whatever that would be. And lastly, from a community standpoint, clear and concise permitting. We're fine doing permits, have no problem with those, and they're necessary, but don't make them burdensome or super expensive. As a not-for-profit, our goal is to provide a competitive, strong service and not raise costs because of added unnecessary costs.
And so do you guys suggest that smaller communities be proactive in pursuing this type of access, or is this something that they kind of just wait and see what happens as you guys kind of expand the network? And if so, how do you suggest they go about being proactive? And how can you guys have kind of already touched upon the second part of this question, in case there's anything forgotten, how can smaller towns provide education on broadband to residents? I think it's really interesting. You kind of both brought up different community institutions like libraries, churches even. I think those are kind of some outside of the box thinking in terms of how to spread that education so you guys don't have to do all the work there.
Well, I mean, my perspective on this would be that rural communities are a huge source of strength, and they have the ability to be really important stakeholders and activists kind of on their own behalf to help coalesce a broadband program in their area. And that doesn't have to be building your own broadband network as a municipality, but it can just be beginning to bring together stakeholders in your community to have these discussions, to reach out to communication service providers in your area, to visit with the state, to examine program opportunities at the federal level that can help to begin to put together the pieces of this puzzle that will bring broadband to your area. So I would advise anyone who's interested in solving this problem to not kind of stand by and wait for someone to come, but to take an active role, to begin to pull together your community, and to realize that you're a force for change and have a lot of power to influence kind of the directionality of where this heads. And so I would encourage everybody to really be a part of solving the problem, because I do feel strongly that we're only going to solve this if we're all working together. It's not a solution that that broadband is going to necessarily just appear one day. It's something that's going to take all of us and a real coalition to make sure we solve the problem.
I totally agree with Matt's comments. As I've mentioned, we have had communities call us, and when we start having further discussions with them, we realize some are totally ready for us and some are a long ways from ready. So there is a little bit of work to do on the community side to truly gauge what the need is. And for us as a cooperative, there's only so much money to go around, and we only have so much time to do it. Some of the things that we're running into, we have managed as many as 100 contractors at one time on top of our existing employees to make this build out happen. And contractors are hard to come by. And you add that into our shortened construction season with frozen ground in winter, and it just makes that a little bit difficult. But that said, we are still planning ahead for tomorrow and next year and 5 and 10 years from now. And so we need to know what communities want us. Get on our list if you're interested and you're within our footprint. I don't see us ever reaching out to Western Iowa, but you know, who knows, stranger things have happened, right? So I just think that staying communicated and staying on top of it, and as Matt alluded to, don't just think someone else is going to do it for you.
Yeah, and of course, an important part of the service is being able to provide an affordable service for individuals. I'm sure that is probably more of a challenge for the smaller communities with less people being connected. Can we go kind of deeper into that process or those programs or those incentives on both of your ends? Kind of how do we make sure that, you know, people aren't just connected, but can do so in an affordable way?
From our vantage point, there are a couple of things just to keep in mind as we talk about affordability. I think the first thing that I would say is that we did that for, especially for low-income families that qualify, the FCC has a program called Lifeline that's available to offset the costs of an internet connection. And so making sure that if there are folks in your community who might qualify for that program, they're aware of it and that they check to see if they could potentially apply to it. That's a really important thing to be doing. As I mentioned earlier this summer, we had a program that provided subscription discounts to households that were not subscribing and could show, basically you had to show that you had a hardship related to the pandemic, and then that $500 subscription discount could be made available to you. I think I'd go back and also return to just the comment about competition, because competition will have an impact on price, and where we worry about you know, higher costs, it's going to be in the areas probably where there's lesser competition, and so that can be another force that will help drive price over time. But affordability as an issue with broadband is going to be with us for a while, and there especially if you're looking at subscription levels that are, say, $100 a month or perhaps even more, and when your family has to choose between maybe a prescription or groceries and an internet connection, those choices are pretty clear. And so what we need to be doing together is thinking about how affordability can be addressed. And there are a lot of communication service providers who are thinking about this, who are aware that this is an issue, and who have programs that can help to address some of those things. We don't have Comcast in this state. Comcast is an example of that, where they have an Internet Essentials program that makes subsidized subscriptions available to people who have a concern about affordability. There's a lot going on in this space, but there's definitely more work to be done.
Sure.
As an electric cooperative, we're always working for trying to ensure that all members have equal access and equal treatments. And I know life is not fair, but with our pricing, because we're new and we're getting started, but we're also not for profit, we think we have set it up for pretty fairly to cover what those construction costs are to bring that service in and maintain it. And so because of that kind of marrying, we've set our prices where we have, and we really have not had much pushback at all. Our basic package is $59.95 a month, and with 85 megabits of service, people seem pretty content with that. Now and then we'll have somebody say to us, well, why don't you just offer us a 25/25 service and only charge us $30? And, you know, that is something that I think over time, maybe we will explore a little bit more, but realistically, we're finding with all the number of devices in a home that quickly 25 and 30 is just not enough. And I also think that until we see a great need for financial hardship, you know, I don't know that as an individual company we can do something. I can see long-term down the road, and I'm talking years, that maybe we come up with something that's very similar to Iowa's energy utility, LIHEAP. You know, we have a heating assistance program that helps people and prevents disconnection during the really cold months. And, you know, maybe there becomes some kind of LIHEAP for broadband that will help low-income people not have to choose between broadband or food or whatnot. But I think we're on the cusp of maybe needing to look at some things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I just got my 5-minute warning here. The time has flown by. So my last kind of big picture question for both of you is, what would you both say a completely connected Iowa would do for the state in the future? Of course, it's not just being able to watch Netflix smoothly or be able to get on Facebook, but what are the possibilities for Iowans, you know, within education, healthcare, agriculture? How would this help improve the state as a whole?
From my vantage point, this is one of the challenges of our moment. When we look at the importance of connectivity in the long run, when we look at the transformation to an information society and a digital economy, having that ability to connect at a high speed to the internet in a reliable way is our key to the future. It's the way we're going to remain competitive on a global basis. It's the way we're increasingly going to receive education. It's the way we're going to connect with each other, and not just right now at this moment while we have a pandemic, but into the future. And so having that connectivity, having all Iowans connected, is going to position the state, position us, our families, our friends, to really be active participants in this 21st century sort of digital future that we're all kind of living in already. And so that is, in my judgment, one of the most important things we can be doing. One of the most important things we need to be thinking about is, how do we make sure that no matter where you live in Iowa, no matter what your income is, no matter what you're doing, your job, your interests, that you are able to receive that connectivity, because that's really going to be your key to the future and kind of your entry pass to this society that we're all going to be living and working in down the road.
Totally agree. Our global economy doesn't care if you live in Chicago or if you live in Shellsburg. Everybody needs service. And I think when you talk about the struggle right now for companies to find employees, and this is a nationwide problem, and now that we've also learned how to work from home, I think if we don't have that connectivity, our businesses are going to struggle even more. They need to have bodies that can work at any point, any place. So.
Well, yeah, we only have a couple minutes left. So I want to thank you both, Patty and Matt, for being able to join us, and thank everybody here in the chat that's tuning in and participating in Iowa Ideas. This is a super important and huge topic that we could probably go on for many more minutes, but we'll wrap things up unless someone has any last second questions. We'll let you guys kind of get moved on to your next sessions, but thank you again, Patty and Matt, for joining us today.
Thank you.
With you.